Well, thank you very much for coming today and for staying for the second session. My name is Emma Cook. I'm a social anthropologist, now in the International Centre. So my talk today is titled Creating Unsustainable Lives, Effects of Gender Norms on Male Freeters. Okay, so in the past 20 years, we've seen a significant increase in irregular work conditions in Japan. So for example, we now know that as of 2012, 38.2% of workers are in the irregular employment sector. Now this is a significant increase. It's actually labelled the feminization of labor, and is something that is happening around the world in post-industrial countries, not just in Japan. So what we see, although it's called the feminization of labor, part of the reason why it's called this is because of the increase in male workers in what has traditionally been a very female-dominated sector. So since 1990, we see that male workers in this kind of sector were at only about 9%, and as of 2012, 2013, it's now roughly 20% of men in this kind of work. Okay, so my research specifically, it's anthropological research. It deals with ethnographic methods, and it really focuses on a topic of worker called Freeter. Now, a Freeter, at its simplest, is someone who is aged 15 to 34, who is not a housewife, not a student, and is working part-time or in arubaito-style jobs. Okay. Now, the term was created back in the 1980s at the height of the bubble economy. This was a time when jobs were very plentiful for young graduates. When the recession hit, when the bubble burst, companies really froze hiring of youth employment, or of new graduates. And this led to an increase in university graduates as Freeters. Now, after this, a moral panic happened, and now we can see that Freeters are basically discussed in two main ways. They are either lazy, irresponsible slackers, or they are victims of the current employment system and of changing school-to-work transitions. One of the things that is happening is, of course, they're part of the panic regarding pension and social welfare system. But recently, they've also been kind of called as a point of concern regarding the fall in marriage rates. Okay, you can actually see on the graph behind me that irregular workers tend to get married at a far lower rate than regular seishain employees. Okay. So, why? Well, of course, financial considerations often come up as being one of the main reasons. We'll talk a little bit about this today. But behind that is actually very normative ideas of gender that continue to construct employment in very gendered ways as well. Okay? So being a Freeter for a male particularly is said to say something very negative about his character. So really my talk today focuses on, well, how do gendered role expectations affect these male Freeters' abilities to create meaningful and sustainable livelihoods for themselves outside of the regular employment market? Just a note, all of my research on this has really taken place in Shizuoka Prefecture in Hamamatsu. It's a mid-sized industrial town, and it is a very conservative area of the country. So please do bear this in mind when I talk to you about my research findings on normative ideals of gender and how people are reacting. So in Hamamatsu, talking to both men and women, people very much continue to aspire to post-war, middle-class family ideals. Well, what is this? Well, the idea of the breadwinner husband and the part-time working housewife. So, of course, with this idea being extremely strong, it became very important in my research to find out, well, what did women think of today's young men? What did women think of young male Freeters? So let's go first to their ideas of today's young men. Well, overwhelmingly, this is what came up. Young men today are weak. You're why? So Akiko, who's 34, she said that they are mentally, emotionally weak. Seishin teki ni yowai. Okay. She said that when she gives them advice, they seem to get smaller. And for her, this is really representative of mental weakness. Ayumi talked about how young men today will quit jobs if they don't like them. And she compared men today to her father's generation who had no choice to do jobs because they were breadwinners. They didn't have the freedom to quit, she would say. And Saki, who was also 34, talked a lot about how young men today think it's okay not to gambaru, to do their best, or gaman, endure difficult situations. And again, so a lot of these comparisons were really between today's young men and their father's generation. Okay. So this brings me on to, well, what did they think of male Freeters then? Well, overwhelmingly, it was very negative. And again, they are mentally and emotionally weak, says Sayuki. I talked about how these young Freeters, male Freeters, are not doing things properly. They're not doing things chanto. Okay? If they quit jobs very easily, if they move around, then it's representative of how they're not able to do things properly. And Aya, a 30-year-old who was already married, talked a lot about how she would feel very embarrassed if she married a Freeter, especially if she had to tell people that her husband was a Freeter. She talked a lot about how he would feel inferior, hikeme, because she would be able to feed him, and that this would cause significant problems in their relationship. So what did women want? Well, women in Hamamatsu tended to have quite a long list of things that they wanted. So the ideal partners were someone who was reliable, mentally, emotionally strong, of course, this came up, kind. This meant different things to different women. Older women talked about men being breadwinners as a form of kindness. Younger women talked about kindness in a much more kind of typical young way of, taking them out for dinners and being nice to them. Yeah. Decisive. And decisive included not asking the women for advice. They wanted men to be able to make decisions when a decision needed to be made. They also wanted a guy to be communicative, so don't ask advice but be communicative. They wanted a man to be steady and trustworthy, and of course, responsible. And this included financial responsibility. Okay. So why? Why did women have this big long list? Why did women still want men to be breadwinners? Well, of course, there are definite financial and structural constraints in the labor market for women in Japan still. Women in Hamamatsu who were even highly educated with career track jobs generally expected to quit when they had their first child. And many said to me that their companies would expect them to quit when they had their first child. So of course, this definitely affects what they want and need in a marital relationship. Now, interestingly, it was female Freeters that were especially critical of the male counterparts. An example of Sumiko and Masao, who'd been together for 6 years. Sumiko basically talked a lot about how it was her dream to be a full-time housewife, and that it was not her responsibility to be a breadwinner. Masao, meanwhile, really felt that it would be okay for them both to keep working, plus he didn't really want the pressure of being a breadwinner, but for Sumiko, this was off the table. So, of course, the pressure that male Freeters receive is partly the result of women's economic position. It's partly the result of expectations. But it's not always about money. So, for example, Yoshio, a 33-year-old high school dropout, was dating a woman 5 years his senior who was a career woman who intended to stick with her job. But she refused to introduce him to her parents. Marriage was off the table because he was a Freeter. Again, this issue of embarrassment. So women's expectations really influence the construction of masculinities and the continuation of gender norms. So I've talked to you a lot about, well, what do women want? Well, what did male Freeters think about marriage? What did they want about marriage? Nobu, a very talented artist who wanted to be an artist, really bemoaned the fact that he wouldn't be able to make enough money from art. Not only that, people stressed that it was not a sustainable livelihood. So he felt that with women's wages being lower, there was no way he could be an artist and marry at the same time. Takeshi, meanwhile, really did kind of feel that he should be the main breadwinner. He wanted that role. He felt it was a duty and an obligation of him. He wanted his wife only to work until they had children. So, of course, these men are also very invested in this ideal of men as breadwinners as well. Now, for some, this kind of pressure really pushed them to push away from marriage. And Hideo, a 34-year-old, basically talked about how he didn't want to always have to think about someone else. He didn't want these pressures. That's marriage, so it's not for me. And he's still unmarried at 39, 40 years old now. So we have two issues coming up, really, on the gender divide. We've got male Freeters who wanted to marry, but they were very worried about money. They felt that they couldn't stay a Freeter and get married as well. They couldn't have their cake and eat it. Women, meanwhile, were not prepared to marry Freeters because of money, but also because of the status of a Freeter. That working as a male Freeter says something very negative about his character. And so, despite the fact that the irregular labor market could be a place where people start to challenge and change gender role expectations, this is really not happening in places like Hamamatsu, because both women and men continue to enforce these post-war gender role expectations. And so I would like to invite all of you to consider not just the case of Hamamatsu, but in other places in Japan and elsewhere, how changing gender norms could help people create sustainable, meaningful lives for themselves outside of normative ideals of working. Thank you very much for your time today.